Hey JB, how you going?
What's up, brother? How are you?
Doing great, thanks. But I got to
How's
try and
life?
figure this one out. So, side by side, that's the one I want because it looks better in the end. Where are you today?
Just got home yesterday after we'd been vacationing in Maine for 3 weeks, and we were trying to switch a flight from Portland, Maine to Boston because on
Hmm.
paper it looked better. And then we get to Boston and the whole world falls apart. So we ended up stuck in Boston for 3 days. So we got back yesterday, and so just kind of coming up for air. And then actually when I hadn't even touched my office set up in 3 weeks. And so when I went to log on, it was like all these updates. I was like, you know what? Let
Were
me
they
just
windy?
I know, no, it's on a damn Mac. So I just pivoted and said, you know what? I'll just do it. I'll do it on the porch with my phone and we'll make it work.
Nice. What part of the world are you in right now?
I live just north of Atlanta, Georgia.
It looks very beautiful and leafy green there.
It is. We were in Maine for 3 weeks, which is where my wife and I are from. We go there every summer, and it was gorgeous there. And then Boston, we got an unexpected 3 day trip extension with my kids and wife to, we made the best of it and explored the city. It's interesting. I was talking to a friend of mine just now before this. When you build a life that it's true that money doesn't solve all problems, absolutely. However, what my kids learned is that there's a level of hysteria that when something goes wrong, folks can enter into. And that was certainly happening at the airport between the poor flight agents not really knowing what to do or how to help everybody, and the lines and long delays and not enough hotels. And I took one look at it and said, I'm just going to get on my phone, find us a hotel on my own. We'll just make this a great trip, and it's just going to cost me money. And if I get paid back, cool. If I don't, whatever. It's worth it to not have the stress. So we did that. And so essentially what we did was opt out of all of just the unhappiness and misery that was around this whole thing. And it it had some unintended awesome benefits, which was it opened up these really neat conversations with my kids. My oldest is about to turn 13. I've got a 10 and an 8-year old, and it probably opened up dialogue that would not have organically happened about why it's important that whatever you choose to do in your life, it's important that you try to make sure you have a sound financial base, because if you do, you can feel for folks who don't have any other options and they are reliant upon hopefully getting a hotel voucher versus staying in the airport. You can just opt out of that and handle it yourself. And there are some things, absolutely some things that money really can solve. And so I don't, in having that conversation with it, was like, I don't attach any moral value, right or wrong, to having more or less money. But it is an indisputable fact that if you have more resources, things like this that happen, if you choose to, can be far less stressful than they would be if you didn't. And I've had both. I've certainly lived in life, didn't grow up with any money, and it was really first 35 years of my life. It was very hand to mouth, and this is much better.
That's absolutely true on one side of things. I think the other side of things that's even less talked about because it sort of breaks some like it's attacking some sacred calves is that how much certain types of financial debt and obligations really put like a millstone around your neck in terms of your freedom. So
Yeah.
it's great to own a home if you own it. It's not so great to be in that like cycle of paying off like a 35 or sometimes even 40-year mortgages now, which people are signing up for. And it's like, okay, I get it. You want to own a home, but is that really home ownership? That's more seems to me like indentured servitude to a bank.
Well, especially if you have a variable interest rate, which is to me just insane, because we have friends that, for whatever reason, they chose a variable interest rate when they bought a home, say 7 years ago. Well, 7 years ago, interest rates were between 2 and 3%. Now, that same home, A, it costs more. B, it's ballooned to 7.5%. There's a very meaningful
2.5x
difference. I
mortgage.
mean, immediately your expenses went up, and of course, taxes, they never go down; they always go up. Insurance has doubled. So you're right. It's really it's provided this interesting, unexpected venue organically to talk about sort of financial management, personal finance with our kids in a way that they certainly aren't going to be taught in school, but in a very practical
No.
way, so they can see like, hey, these are the decisions that you would want to make while you're still very young. That if you do, will put you so far ahead of the game when it comes to the freedom that you can experience later in life. So
That
how have you been, my friend? How's your family? How's I just kicked the thing. How's business?
okay, let's talk about all of those. So
Yeah.
family is really good. Everyone is fit and healthy, thank God. Why is there some music playing in the background here? I gotta
What
find
me?
this music and turn it off. No, it's
Is it
definitely me.
is it Gaelic or Celtic music?
No, it sounds like some kind of a YouTube video. So let me find the appropriate tab and
It's
pause it.
not even good music.
Yeah, it's that kind of like, really high tempo, sort of metallic sounding
Oh,
electronic music.
okay.
There it is. Okay, I got rid of it.
I wasn't hearing it. I think it was just you.
Just me. And then there's also multiple dings from my son trying to get me to authorize downloading some new apps on his iPad, which I'm going to say no to all of them or just ignore. But yeah, everyone's doing great. We are packing up the house right now. We're moving to from Ireland to Spain in about 5 weeks' time, which is going to be awesome. Really,
Wow.
yeah, it's cool. We had come back to Ireland and sort of thinking, what are we going to do? We started a small business for my wife. I'm online, so I'm kind of untethered, and that was intentional. I was previously in the construction industry. I wanted to be untethered because I'd done enough of being
Mm,
tethered,
yeah.
tethered, and I knew when we came back that it wasn't going to be forever. I
Mm.
love home, but I'd left at a certain age, and I'd left for reasons. I was like, those reasons haven't kind of gone away. Like I'm older, I'm a little bit more mature and sensible, a bit more appreciative of the good things I had growing up and
Mm.
the good family I have. My mom and dad are awesome. My siblings are fantastic. But the reasons for me leaving sort of persist. I don't feel like that I can kind of fulfill all of who I am living here. Let's put it like
Mm.
that. And so there were certain roadblocks in the way. My wife wanted to become a citizen, and that was very important for us so we can travel more freely going forward. Her birth passport from Fiji doesn't do a lot for the citizens.
Mm.
And then we wanted to get her driver's license, a European driver's license, which is easy to do here in Ireland in English, wouldn't be so difficult, easy to do in another European country, not in English. So we've done all those things. He said, okay, we're not doing any more Irish winters. That's another thing. No more Irish winters. Too much rain, not enough daylight. The day when it like the sun comes up around 9:30 and then goes back down around 3, it kind of gets old real fast.
Yeah.
So all of
That's
those things are good.
Maine is very much like that, by the way. So different but same. We
Hmm.
travel to Maine in the summertime because it's beautiful and there's a lot of wonderful things about Maine. I'm very grateful that that's the state that I was raised in. But to your point, I did not enjoy the winters anymore. I did not enjoy it getting dark at 3 p.m. And there's also a beautiful blue collar work ethic there, which has some tremendous benefits to it. But there's also with that there's a at times a narrowness in possibility and the narrowness
Hmm.
in thinking that I did not want to be around or to raise my kids around. And so I can relate.
Pretty much similar types of reasons. I think in Ireland, there's not as much. Things are kind of become more aspirational in recent years. But there is also a sense that the drinking culture here is still more than I like, and I don't feel comfortable with. I grew up with it. I did a lot of stupid shit in my 20s. I don't really fancy my kids doing the same. I was like, I want to move somewhere where I'm more like I think the Mediterranean drinking culture is good, which is like you're going to have some wine at dinner, then you're going to chill for a while, then you're going to go dance. You might have a couple of
Moderation.
drinks during the night, and you'll stay until 6 a.m., but you'll actually get home sober and in one piece. And you probably won't spend the next day vomiting up last night's drinks. So that's a much
You know,
healthier drinking culture.
you know what's funny about it is there must be something. So I'm ethnically Irish
Hmm.
from a DNA perspective, and you just described my teens and 20s. So maybe it's more the blood than it is the country. But yeah, I know exactly what you mean.
It's possibly both, but I just figured like a little environmental shift won't do any harm to anyone from that perspective. You talked about those mortgage rates. My dad told me when he bought his first house, I think in 79, like before I
Oh,
was born, or
I'm sure
or
they were crazy.
1980, 14, he remembers 14% interest on his first mortgage.
Oh,
And that wasn't an interest only mortgage, that was principal plus interest. So it was the full whack. But he said it was actually affordable in those days, which is
yeah,
crazy. And
because the house cost like 25 grand back then.
oh, less. I think less. I think Ireland had just gone just decimalized, and we just moved off doing things like shillings in the years before. Like people didn't make much, but if you had like a good, solid, like kind of industrial type job, you were pretty well set, and you could afford a house, even at 14% interest. You could afford a house on one income, which is crazy to think about how things have changed. Where people are freaking out, like a 7% interest puts families on the street now. It's crazy.
Yeah, I had this interesting. By the way, it just started pouring here. Is it too loud, or can you hear me just fine?
No, it's perfect. Your voice isolation's working properly.
Beautiful. So I had a series really of interesting conversations because being in mergers and acquisitions, I get the privilege, and I mean that, of working with and speaking to just a broad swath of different types of people, different age demographics, different backgrounds, different nationalities. It's really one of the most fun parts of what I do. But a lot lately of the interactions I've had have been with sort of baby boomer type American folks. And there's an ethos that underpins that generation of sort of looking at younger generations, whether it's X or certainly millennials or Z, or I suppose right below them that would be my kids. And I think we're calling them Gen Alpha. I don't know. Um, there's a sense with the boomers that those generations aren't working as hard, or are lazy, and just don't want to go out and make it happen. And I do think to some degree, in some ways, that might be true. However, I think what that generation sometimes misses is that they also grew up in a time where conditions were very favorable. They were the children of the greatest generation who really had it tough after the Depression, whatever country you were in. And you had these world wars that had happened. And at the time, the fruits of the Industrial Revolution were in full effect. So you could get a job as a union person in almost any industry, and with a single income, you were able to afford a pretty nice house in a pretty safe, nice neighborhood, an automobile, at least one, put food on the table, and have a good, solid middle class life. Now we live in a time where that's really difficult because the costs of things materially have changed, and it's more than just inflation. It's there are a lot of factors that have gone into making middle classhood, wherever you are, a whole lot harder to attain with a single income, if not impossible, unless you're really top 5% earner. And so the subject has a lot more nuance to it than some of the boomers, I think, would like to think, because as we just talked about, yeah, interest rates you can point to in the US, they call it the Carter years. Interest rate during the Carter administration, they were in the teens. However, what you could purchase a 3-bedroom, 2-bath house for in most American cities at that time was, you can't even compare it to what it would cost to buy one in a normal American city now. Atlanta, I think the median home price right now in Atlanta, Georgia, which is a fairly low cost city compared to the rest of the US, it's still 350 to 400,000. And I can tell you that for my family of 5, we would not be able to find a home anywhere near that would work for us at that price point. So there's just this interesting dynamic where baby boomers who own businesses, they didn't really succession plan. They thought that Johnny or Susie would take over the business at some point. Johnny and Susie don't want to take over mom and dad's whatever ball bearing factory or whatever it is. They want to be influencers, and they're beginning to understand a different type of economy than we've ever had before, the gig economy and whatever that is. And like you and I were talking about, embracing the flexibility that you can have if you want it to be somewhat untethered, as you said. And because of that, there's a little bit of, I think, a confusion from the baby boomer generation around, like, what are these kids doing? And I just think that the thing that's missed is that the world has changed. My wife and I say this all the time. We have to raise our children for the world that they're going to live in, not the world that we grew up in or that our parents grew up in, because the truth is it's not the same world at all.
No,
and I don't
no.
think that's good or bad. It just is.
It is what it is. I mean, it's such a trite cliche, but it just gets you around any situation. It is what it is.
Yeah,
It's
it is what it is.
it's just acceptance of like the raw reality in front of you.
And no problem was ever solved by bitching about it, ever.
It's true. So I don't get to speak to people of that generation as much. I mean, the closest to it might be my dad, but he's not a baby boomer. Like, he's 70 now, so he's still a little bit too young to be a baby boomer. He's like
Yeah,
born in the 60s.
he's an
And the
old Gen
dynamic
Xer.
here was maybe the dynamic here was a little different as well, because I think Ireland like modernized later than a lot of other countries. We like got
Yeah,
into the European Union in the 70s and things really took off then. But up until then, we were still feeling the effects in Ireland of before I was born, but from my dad's account of like that post-war deprivation.
famine. Yeah,
And so, he sort of thinks about, he's like, I saw what the 1950s were like, the years after the war, and they were not good. Things were very tough. There was, he said, like, he grew up in a kind of like middle class in a suburb in Dublin, but he said, like, he remembers a lot of poverty on the street and, being very visible of ordinary people. But I think for that older generation, maybe what they miss sometimes is that there's not just that there's a different world, but there's a completely different sets of incentives for younger people now. And there's all these really strong like what is it doctrinal forces, or like just I guess almost propaganda,
It is
telling them, hey,
propaganda.
you can have it all, you can be free, you can be completely you can have all your rights and you don't have to worry too much about responsibilities. Now, we both know that's not true, but that is the kind of the package that's being sold to people through things like social media about how easy life can be. And it certainly can, and it probably can be for as many people, or as many for any subset of human beings who are prepared to actually look outside their immediate environment and say, I can do different than what I'm doing right now. I can make a hell of a lot more money. I can do stuff that was unimaginable a decade ago. But for the, there's still someone's still got to work in the ball bearing factory, because that's in the end what makes society continue to be functional on a day-to-day
Somebody
basis.
has to do it. And I tell you, I don't know if this is true in the EU. I suspect it is because I know I have a client who is in Dubai and it's true there. But in the US, there's been this fascinating shift in the economy in terms of what earning potential is. And now, for the next probably at least decade or so, if you're just a person who's going to leave, we call it high school, I suppose primary for you guys, it really it used to be for decades, and this was me growing. You got to go to college. You got to go to college if you want to make it. You got to go to college. And so I'm 44. So depending on who you ask, I'm either a very young Gen Xer or a very old millennial. So it's sort of this little sandwich generation that we don't really have a
Exactly
belonging to.
same.
Yeah, either it's like either place. I don't really know how to identify. And the truth is, probably have some sensibilities of both. And
Hmm.
so for us, it was go to college, go to college, go to college. There wasn't any real reason behind it. It was just that's what you have to do. And even at the time, you couldn't really get an interview for a meaningful job at a Fortune 500 company unless you had a college degree. So that's what you did. Now that's changed, and I think rightfully people are beginning to re-examine the utility of probably going significantly into debt, and also the part that people don't talk about, losing 4 years of meaningful on the job training and earning potential, 4 years of earning potential, at least more if you're going for graduate studies, to then come out and make 35 to $55,000 a year doesn't make a lot of sense. So in the US, what's happening is for so long, teachers, society were so anti trades, whether that was electricians, plumbers, welders, you name it, HVAC. Nobody did it, mechanics. And so now you have this massive shortage of competent, qualified professionals in those fields. Well, what happens when you have any sort of shortage in any market condition? The amount that you have to pay people who are able to do those things will grow, 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 grow. So now one of the best opportunities, and any young person that asks me, what should I do? Unless they have a very specific career plan and it's very specialized. So I want to be a physician. I want to be an accountant. I want to be a lawyer, whatever that is. Unless they, for whatever reason, at 18 years old, know that. And they're just trying to figure out, how do I get a decent start in life and make some money without going into, massive debt? First thing I always tell them is to go on job sites and look at what the average hourly rate is for a tradesperson, and look at the amount of time and cost it will take to learn that trade, and compare that to going to college for 4 years, and then the type of entry level professional type job that you can get and what that job pays. We have welders in the United States that are making $100 to $150 an hour, and it takes, I think, 18 months to learn that trade at least well enough to get one of those jobs. Now you won't start off probably at 150, but you'll start off at $50 or $60 an hour. And so we live in this fascinating time where, as a dad with three young kids, I want all my kids to have a base level understanding of how to fix things themselves. I would love for them all to at least learn a trade, whether they use it or not, because someone's going to have to continue to do those things. And those are going to become societally critical roles that someone will not only have to fill, but be compensated really well to fill. And then at the same time, if you're able to learn by experience and just the sheer amount of information that's available on YouTube, how to be a decent financial steward and a business person, you combine those two things and you can really build an unbelievable life for yourself. I think it's taking society a minute to shed that old bias toward a piece of paper being the only viable and legitimate benchmark that you're an educated person. Because here's the other sad reality. I look back at the degree that I got. It was a degree in psychology. Clinical psychology was the degree that I got. Well, and I own a mergers and acquisitions company, and buy and sell different businesses. I arrange financing for people. Essentially, I'm just a deal maker. I did not need to get that degree. Certainly there are some things I pulled from psychology, but I could have learned those things reading a book. Or if we had YouTube back then, I would have been able to learn it too. It was even then it was $110,000 total for 4 years of education. Probably not the best investment that I've ever made. And so I do think we're in this fascinating time where culturally, not just in the US, the world in general, we're starting to ask good questions and say, wait, is it the most logical thing for me to go and hang out for 4 years somewhere in hopes that I get a job doing something of which I have no idea right now? Because at 18, I didn't know what the heck I was going to be. I think I was just a few years past the learning to tie my shoes, if I'm honest. And so we live in a fascinating time, but the thing that has never changed and will never change is that if you're willing to use a dirty 4 letter word, WORK, if you're willing to use that word and figure out in whatever way it means to you to go and do that, you can have a great life still. You really can. Just the days of, well, if I go to college and graduate, I've hit the lottery. Those days are gone.
That narrative still has a hold on a lot of people. I mean, I grew up in that narrative. I went to college twice, dropped out the first time, went to business school, dropped out. Second time went back, just did a typical well, it was a 3 year degree, I think, but what you call a 4 year degree in America, where I did philosophy. And
Mm-hmm.
while I had a lot of fun, party a lot,
Oh yeah, I was right there with you, buddy.
I like definitely got a lot of good out of it. But then I think in retrospect, it probably wasn't the best decision. Lucky thing was no bill. It was all bankrolled by the government, thank God, and probably a few quid from mom and dad. But that's like there was no tuition fees at that time, so we were really lucky. But like all this shortages of skilled people is a huge thing because I on the marketing side work with people in blue collar businesses, and this is a
Mm-hmm.
constant thing. How do we grow a
Yeah.
team?
Can they
How do we
even
keep them
find
motivated?
employees?
How can we even find people who have the basic skills? Can we take the risk of investing in training people who are less skilled? And how do we psychologically profile them to know that they've got the stick to itiveness to actually keep the job for a year and not go off to try and be a YouTube influencer or something? But you mentioned
Instagram
all these
model.
skill trades, which are super valuable. I did years in construction. After I graduated my philosophy degree, I went off into the construction industry. Of course, as you do. So it didn't have any logical
Makes
connection. But
sense.
I learned so many skills during those years. Like I'm at this point in my life, don't really use this stuff practically anymore. But like I'm a competent welder. I'm a decently competent like diesel mechanic. I'm, I highly skilled, just although rusty cabinet maker and like wooden boat builder and fine finish carpenter. I can fix that breaks, and I'll always be able to fix that breaks. I'll have no problem like ripping open the doors, like the door cards in my car, like to pull out a busted lock motor or something like that. So all those are great. And that thought process of if shit is broken in front of me, I can probably fix it some way has like bled on to my current career, which is marketing, which a lot of people think is some kind of thing you go to college to learn. In the
No.
practical doing of it, it's just like a skilled trade. It's more like carpentry and plumbing than it is like accountancy or engineering.
Well, an academic marketing is usually they have no idea what actually works in the real world. And marketing is such a, you and I both know this. Marketing is such a broad term that
Mm-hmm.
what you need to understand to market. So I'm one of the benefits I get is being multi-sector. So what it takes to be a really great marketing lead in an e-commerce business is materially different than what it takes to be a great marketing lead in manufacturing or a B2B service. There is some carryover, sure. There's some fundamentals that you need to understand, but there's enough nuance, and the nuance that's where the devil is. That's the details is where the devil is. You have to really understand it. There's no, to my, at least so far from what I've seen, and you're talking about hundreds of businesses that I've had the pleasure of working with and talking to. There is no substitute for that practical experience, and it's the great, speaking of philosophy, the great philosopher Michael Tyson, his quote about everybody has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. You got to get punched in the mouth a little bit. You just have to get in there and know that you're going to take some butt whoopings. But in every one of those, you learn something new, perhaps learn what not to do the next time. And that, to me, that is education. That is practical, meaningful, and real, as opposed to, and I'm not anti-college. I'm not, for the right people and for the right person. But a lot of that is theoretical. It's not practical. And the issue with, theoretical is you have folks that maybe get a marketing degree and then they go and they work for the company as their, some lower level marketing. And none of the things that they learned in college work. And then they're freaked out because they're like, this was supposed to work. I don't know what to do. I have now this existential crisis of my professor said that, this, and this would work. And 3 weeks in, I am an epic catastrophic failure. I have no idea what I'm doing. And, I always tell folks that's okay, because that's the moment where you're ready to actually start your real education. And now the question is for young people, do I bother going through the 4 years of this theoretical formal education? Or do I try to get in with a company or a project that I believe in, that's meaningful, that I think has great upside, and most importantly, is full of people who are really competent, who I can learn from? And that to me is where we're going. But then you hit on something really interesting a minute ago, and I want to dig into that because I've been thinking about this for months. When I was growing up in the 80s, and certainly more so before then, I remember trades unions in particular in the US, with trades having these apprenticeship programs that were fairly long but very structured. And, hence apprentice, journeyman, master, etc. We went so hard into the whole college economy and the college being the only path, we sort of abandoned that. And a lot of companies even abandoned having programs like that. And so now we find ourselves at this interesting juncture in history where it's sort of like, maybe we consider going back to what we were doing before. And we have these long training programs. We don't necessarily expect someone to have a college degree. In fact, we may be better off finding a responsible, level-headed, high school graduate, if you can identify that, and you hit on that a minute ago, but that we're willing to train, knowing that we may lose some of them to go do something else, but that it may still be, given the cost of recruiting and hiring folks and still having to train them, it may be more cost effective and practical to just reinstate some of those longer tail training and apprenticeship programs to train people in the way that we want to do things. And I think we haven't quite gotten there. We haven't caught up yet, but I hope that that's, where we're going. And this doesn't just, I don't think this is just trades, John. I think it's interesting that Google has started doing it. So Google now, they start with their 6-month certificate program that's not very expensive. And you can learn any number of technical tasks that are necessary for that. And then if you complete it and do well, they'll hire you. And so I do think we are moving towards, this is the right way to go. I think we're moving towards almost old is new again, where we're going to go back to training people. And maybe we shouldn't have abandoned that in the first place.
Yeah, back toward this more vocational model of education, which still exists in some places. The Germans do. I've met people the world, and you find them overseas, mostly in Germany, but they still have the old what they call Zimmerman, which is Zimmerman, I believe, is journeyman. It's like they still have the apprenticeship where you have to wear a specific trade, like a trade uniform.
Yeah,
and part of your journey to becoming what's I think acknowledged as a Meister, somebody who's a master of your craft, is that you have to leave your hometown and you have to spend a period of 3 or 4 years traveling around different parts of Germany and working with different highly skilled masters in that craft. And
Love it.
You're allowed to stay for a certain period of time. You're limited, for a certain period of time, but with each shop, and you have to complete when you go there. They pay you a very low wage and they give you board and you up your skill. And then the interesting part is that the masters of those trade shops, if they're in a guild, they can't refuse an apprentice who shows up. If they've got a space in their shop and an apprentice shows up at the door, they can't refuse them. Have to give them a try. And those guys spend you, and some of them go international. There's like an international network of German-owned businesses. Some of them will go to as well. Really, really interesting stuff. And for that reason, they still have all of their heritage crafts like to a very high level in there. And some of those guys will come to Ireland for a couple of summers, and they're in a high demand from Irish contractors because of the quality of work that they'll do.
That's fantastic, man. I think that, of course, I have an American-centric perspective, and I think we've missed there. I really do. I think we've missed. I think we went so far towards the 80s and 90s, sort of this extreme Gordon Gekko capitalism, that you had all these folks that would watch movies like Wall Street or Boiler Room or whatever, and they would see some sort of corporate job as the way forward. And the reality was always that only the best of the best and certain personality types, very particular personality types, were going to do well in that field long term, and even find purpose, satisfaction, meaning in those careers. And for some reason, in America anyway, we threw the baby out with the bathwater and we just started pushing everybody in that direction. And it got to the point where there was, even now, there's an absurdity to me to the narrative that you'll hear. Well, just, got to get an education, go to college. The rest will figure itself out. Well, how? That's a terrible idea. That's a bit like saying, you know what, just go down to the airport, pick a plane, any plane, get on the plane, and then wherever you land, hopefully the best, works out. That's a terrible strategy. And so I really, it's a fascinating time to certainly be a parent. It's an equally fascinating time to be in a position where I'm speaking with so many business owners about the strange dynamics and business owners in different countries that are presenting themselves. Labor is an issue everywhere. And I do think part of that, some of that I sympathize with employers, but I also think we did it to ourselves to some degree, because you can't out of one side of your mouth complain about a lack of qualified talent and retention, and on the other side of your mouth say, oh, we can't afford to train people or pay them. Like those two things, they don't line up well together. And so to me, the companies that I love to talk to are the ones who are at least in earnest trying to figure out, okay, how do we step back 5 or 6 steps and figure out how do we bring people in knowing that they may not have the specific skills that we need, but that they may have the traits that will allow them to learn it. And we're willing to invest in teaching those people that thing. And the whole argument of, well, what if we train them and they leave? There's an old axiom that, and I'm sure some brilliant person said it, I just don't know who it was. It was sort of like, well, what if we invest all this money in training our employees and training new people and they leave? And the person says, well, what if we don't train them and they stay?
That's awesome. It's so good and so true. Let's talk a bit more about that. There was a lot of stuff I could go with this stuff about college, because like those
Sure,
movies you
brother.
mentioned, those are both cautionary tales. I think the last remaining vestige about the whole college thing, and I want to move on from this, but is like social pressure. It's respectability. Like my
Yes.
wife's still in the grip of it. She's her family are Indian, and like there's 5 career paths for an Indian son:
Yes.
doctor, lawyer, accountant, engineer, and disgrace. And so she's already at me about like what are we going to do with our son. I was like, he's 8 years old, and like his favorite thing in the world is just playing soccer. So let's
Yeah.
just not worry too much.
Dinosaurs.
My He won't listen to it, but my way of subverting that is like I'm already telling the kids, you got to figure out some hustles, you got to start to make some money for yourselves before
Yeah.
you're like about 14, 15. Because if they get that taste for making their own cash when they're 12, 13, 14,
It
by the time they're
translates.
18 and it's college time, they probably have enough money they don't have to do what mom and dad say anymore. And then they're
Mhm.
whatever, they're good.
Let me tag on and then we can pivot to whatever you want. But let me reinforce what you just said with a very real story that just happened. So I have a wonderful client who lives in Dubai. He's originally citizenship wise Canadian, but in Canada he was first. His parents were first generation, and they immigrated there from Iran, so Iranian ethnically. And he tried to get into medical school, had a hard time with the MCATs. Well, it's not called the MCATs in Canada, but whatever their version of it is. And very, very smart guy. And so instead, he ended up building this e-commerce company. Well, in 4 years, he built this e-commerce company to the point where it's doing $50 million a year in revenue with unbelievable margins. And he contacted me not to exit, which is unusual. It's not unusual that I'll get someone to reach out for any number of, leadership or corporate structure or strategic issues. But most of the time, they're at least thinking about an exit, whether it's now or 5 years from now. And they want to know, okay, how do we best position ourselves to really nail the landing? That's not what he needed. That's what he thought he needed. But he said, well, maybe I'll acquire another business. And this is like a 2 month conversation, John, that I'm having with this guy. And he's young. He's, compared to me, he's just turned 30. And what I finally figured out, and I just said to him one day, was I said, I'll call him Steve. It's clearly not his name, but I'll call him Steve. I said, Steve, can I share an observation and just a gut feeling with you? Do we have enough respect for me to do that? And he said, yeah, of course. I said, I don't really think you want to sell your business. I don't actually think you should acquire another business. I think what's really happening is that I think you're having a bit of an identity crisis and a self-esteem issue, because what you've told me is that your parents are profoundly disappointed in your career choice, despite the fact that you are vastly more successful than any of your peers financially. But because you don't have JD or MD after your name, you're an abject failure in the eyes of your parents, even though I was in the medical industry for years myself. And I know that for the first 10 years, unless you're a neurosurgeon or a couple of very particular specialties, you really don't have that much money. And the debt that you have is almost unimaginable. And because of all of that, you have this sort of internal sense that you're a failure. And I think you're just searching for ways to validate externally the life path that you've chosen. And here's the reality. And he's like, well, so, and he's nodding and he's going, oh my gosh, I think you're right. So what do I do? And I said, I have a really elaborate and sophisticated and eloquent suggestion. He said, what is it? And I said, nothing. And he said, what do you mean nothing? I said, you've already won. You have already won, Steve. You have more money than you'll ever spend. You're doing a great job putting that money away because you haven't significantly increased your lifestyle compared to what you're now earning. You have so much money. You've purchased a home for your parents. You've taken care of your siblings. You've already won the game. Your brain just hasn't caught up yet with realizing that you took a different path, but the path that you chose was a shortcut. And by the age of 30, you've financially already won the game and you're already successful. So why are you chasing validation from people who will never in their entire life accomplish what you already have? And it took him a minute, but he actually broke down and he said, gosh, you're right. And so I said, look, I can sell you something. I could go find you a business and make some money for myself. I could help you exit your business and make a check, but I would be doing you an enormous disservice because none of those things would fill the void that you're really trying to fill, which is wishing that people would give you a little bit more credibility and respect. I joke, I was like, you just want people to put respect on your name. He said, that's exactly right. I said, well, you're never going to get it because that's just the world we live in. Somebody else has. What matters is objective results. You've already won. So stop seeking that approval from people who are never going to be in a position to give it to you. And so I think you're spot on. And there is this ethos of if you don't have a certain piece of paper on the wall, then you're not legit. But here's the problem. It's an unwinnable game because you get the piece of paper on the wall and then what's going to happen? Well, then you're going to have folks that say, well, that piece of paper is from the wrong institution. It's not as good as this institution. Oh, well, you only have the undergraduate. You don't have the master's. Oh, you have the master's, but you don't have the doctorate. Oh, you have the doctorate, but you didn't get it from. That's a game that you will never win, ever. And
I
so,
drive a Porsche. He drives a Ferrari. That one's got a Bugatti. This guy's in this golf club. This guy's in another golf club that you can't get into without being invited by somebody who's in the other golf club, and it never ends. The quest for respect and validation never ends.
this guy has a McLaren. He lives in Dubai, and he was miserable. And I said, honestly, don't bullshit me. When you bought that McLaren and you moved to where you moved to and you lived where you lived and you had some of the experiences that you had, and he's also not married. So he's doing exactly what I would have done at 30 with the amount of money that he has. I said, after you did all of those things that you did, going into it, I'm sure you thought that thing, whether it was the car, the place to live, the women, the lifestyle, that thing each time would be the thing that finally made you feel whole. It made you happy. Did any of them? Or did afterwards you actually feel worse because you realized you spent the money, you did the thing, you have the thing, you thought it was going to be the magic bullet that would make you feel like you had arrived and that you were go back to psychology, you were a self-actualized person, and it didn't. And then that led you even further into despair. So then you just kept seeking more things to try to fill that void with. The problem is it's a void that you're trying to fill with the wrong things. And what I told him as an older guy with a little bit of gray in the beard, being generous, was I said, here's the reality. Until you meet the person, hopefully, that you want to build the rest of your life with, and you start to build that family unit, which he does want, some of those questions will never be answered until you first look into the eyes of the person that you will be with for the rest of your life. And if you end up having children, from my own experience, almost every question I had about why I was here and what my purpose was, I kid you not, was answered immediately when I looked into the eyes of my firstborn the first time I held them. And then once that happens, everything else becomes sort of just irrelevant.
JB, it sounds like the psychology degree you got was actually a pretty decent investment, in fairness.
Now, I did meet my wife there. That's the joke I made. I said,
Okay.
it was worth what I paid because I met my wife, and so I can never count it as a wasted experience. But I always tell folks this if I'm asked, which is the majority of my education, even in college, had more to do with the experiences that were happening than anything, academic. In college, I had to work two jobs because we did not come from means, and in the U.S., unless you had great grades in high school and a little bit of luck, Nobody was going to pay for it. I did not have great
Hmm.
grades in high school. And at the time, I didn't have a lot of luck. So, I had to pay for it. So just learning to budget my time, how to figure out what the most important thing today, this week, this month is, and only focus on that and ignore the rest. Social networking, understanding how to do that. I was in a fraternity and you had to make that profitable. Those those really were the lessons. I thought those were the things that I had to do just to get by while I was doing the most important thing, which was college. It wasn't until decades later that I looked back and realized, no, that was the education. The education was what I had to do to make it happen. Because once you hit on something really important, once you understand the concept of why have a side hustle and what does it take to get into that side hustle, and how do you turn that into something profitable? And then once it's profitable, how do you continue to make that same level of money while incrementally reducing the amount of time that you have to spend on doing it? Those are life skills that are so much more valuable than, and again, the caveat is if you're going to if you want to become a surgeon, lawyer, or accountant, or maybe engineer, you have to put that to the side. Please go to college for those things. But anything else, it's the stuff that you learn along the journey you realize later on is really what the education.
I want to talk about your journey a little bit in the time we have remaining, because you are primarily known for a person who does mergers and acquisitions and helps to buy companies, sell companies, and put groups of companies together into bigger companies. But you are unusual in the sense that you are not a person from the kind of corporate finance, kind of like investment banking. Uh, I don't think you're the type of guy who probably has too many suits in the wardrobe. And more often, you seem to spend a lot of your time in the world of marketing, masterminds, personal development, and other kind of stuff that is in some ways anathema to that corporate world. So how did
Mm-hmm.
that happen?
It's a total accident. The joke. I've Forrest Gump my way through everything I've ever done, and I've had the privilege of meeting the right people at the right time. I'm insatiably curious. I'm just a genuinely curious person. I like people. I like to understand people, why they made the decisions that they made, what were the cause and effect of those decisions. And so I was in corporate for a long time. So when I left college, like everybody else, I said, well, I guess this is what I'm supposed to do. And I got into corporate first in sales, because if you can talk and you like people, that's just where they stick you.
Mm.
And so did well, worked my way up in corporate America that way. And then eventually I found myself into roles that I could only now describe as a fixer. That's really what I was. That's what I spent the bulk of my corporate career doing, was whatever, anytime there was an expensive sort of nebulous problem that the organization that I worked for had a hard time figuring out what to do, they would just sort of drop me in by a parachute to figure it out. And I was, in most cases, operating outside of the normal corporate structure. And I think in retrospect, part of that was because of the way my brain worked, and just I liked solving unusual problems. I also think part of that was because I was always an entrepreneur with the heart of an entrepreneur who just happened to find myself in a corporate environment. And because of that, I didn't exactly fit inside the corporate culture. So there's sort of like, let's put him over here. He's really valuable to us, but we don't necessarily want him on our conference calls because he's going to say something that's going to freak people out. And so did that for quite a while. And then I just had this sort of epiphany where I just had our second child, and my oldest was, I think, 3, maybe younger at the time. And I was traveling all over the place working for a very large company that specialized in surgical robotics. And I was in that fixer role where, a company would spend $50 million for these surgical robots. They'd put them into their hospital system and they would turn into expensive coat hangers, which makes people very angry. And so I would go in and figure out why were they not being utilized? What was the problem? If, the procedures were costing more than they would have doing them without the surgical robots, why was that happening? What did the leadership look like? What was happening in the actual procedure look like in terms of who was in the room, the things that were being used, the way that the things were going, and just sort of quantify, document, and remediate whatever it was. Well, I was doing that, and it wasn't bad, certainly intellectually stimulating. And if I'm fully transparent, it was a giant ego trip to have, world-renowned surgeons in a room look at me, who barely graduated from college, and say, JB, what do we do next? It was a pretty big ego trip. Well, I had been gone for 6 weeks almost straight. I would come home on the weekends, but usually I'd come home Friday and I'd go right back out Sunday or Monday. And that was causing some strain on my marriage, which is very important to me. And I had been promised that I'd be home for a week because I had just been going above and beyond, and they knew it. So I was supposed to be home for a week, and I had promised my then, I think he was 3-year old son, like, hey, buddy, daddy's going to be home for a week. I know I've been gone a lot, but we're going to go fishing and we have all these great plans and we're going to spend time together. And so I got home on a Thursday night, went to sleep, woke up Friday morning, and a phone call from a California number because the companies that I worked for were always based out in Silicon Valley. And as soon as I saw that number come up, I knew it was something. So I pick it up and I reported to the chief medical officer of that company. And the CMO said, hey, I know that she was so nonchalant about it. She's like, hey, I know you're supposed to be home for a week, but we have this problem at this hospital in Seattle. It's a really expensive problem. We're at risk of having to pull all of our equipment out. It's a multi-million-dollar problem. You're the only one that we can send. We need you to go. I've already booked you a flight and a car is going to pick you up in 2 hours. She didn't ask me. She just said, this is what's going to happen. And, I was annoyed, but at that time, my mindset was very much, okay, that sucks, but I have to do it. So let me go about getting ready to leave and da, da, da. So I packed my suitcase and I'm getting ready to walk out the door. And in our house, John, it's a 2-story foyer. And at the top, there's a big with railings. And as I'm getting ready to open the door to go out to the car that's picking me up, for some reason, I just turned back and I looked up over my shoulder and I see my 3-year-old son. And he's got his little hands on the bars and he's just looking down and there's just tears streaming down his face. I've never felt like a bigger piece of shit in my entire life than that moment because I'm realizing, and I said it for a long time, I said through no fault of my own. That's not true anymore. But I said through no fault of my own, I lied to my son. And now I know it was absolutely my fault because I allowed my boundaries to consistently be crossed that way. That was my fault. Radical accountability. But I have 3 steps on between my porch. By the time I hit the pavement from the top step, I knew that was my last week at that job. I also knew that I was done with corporate America. And so I fulfilled that obligation. I left the organization. They tried to come back and throw a bunch of money at me. They could have offered me $50 million a year. I won't say I wouldn't have taken it, but I would have taken it for 1 year and then I would have left. But but it wouldn't have mattered. Started a company because I didn't know what else to do. That was an e-commerce company. Did a bunch of research, got into Amazon back then early and figured out a niche, which at the time was high-end bourbon and cigar accessories for men, because
Okay.
that's who I was. That's what I did. That's who I was. And there was a
You
gap.
were early on that trend, man. Because
I
that's
was
exploded in the last few years.
super early. This was 2011. And
So
so,
about 5 years early on what has become now an explosive trend, right? For the last 5 years.
yeah, yeah. So and with that, this is the Forrest Gump part. First started with just finding products that already existed and I would sell them under their name, sort of a drop ship type model. And then I had this thought, man, there's a lot of hands that are touching these products between when they're manufactured and when they're getting even to me, let alone to the end customer. And every time a pair of hands touches that product, the cost goes up to the end consumer
Mm-hmm.
and to me as the business owner. So I wonder if there's a way for me to eliminate at least some of those touch points. And that was that thought. And it was in the shower. For some reason, most of my
Best
good
thoughts ever
thoughts are in the
come.
shower. In the shower, it's like
Always.
nobody's asking me questions. I don't have any distractions. So I ended up going to China, building some really great relationships in China and understanding how business is done there. That led me to India, to Central America, because they just were. I figured out that different areas were better at providing different types of products, and we had leather goods, we had beautiful hand carved wooden goods, and then we had some more, mechanical pieces that were just fine to be made in China. Did that and ended up selling that business. It did pretty well, and then I ended up selling it because there was a guy that I was in India actually, and he was one of the suppliers, and he's like, "Hey, would you ever consider selling it?" And I hadn't thought about it, but I was like, "Well, I guess everything's for sale." And he made me an offer that was pretty good, and I did something, and he'll come back to this. I hired a broker to help me do it, and the guy was terrible. Really didn't bring any value. I ended up doing most of the work myself, and
This is
so
the classic story, right?
it is. I mean, it really everything, almost everything that I've ever done in life that has turned out well, it's just been me recognizing friction and trying to figure out how to make it less friction filled and solving the problem for myself. And then like, oh, wait a minute, I bet other people are having the same problem. So did that, started another business. The other business, actually, because of all that I had learned with the international shipping and logistics and craziness, one of the things that we were doing was helping other people go to other countries and source their own products and figure out how to work with different manufacturers and prototyping and IP. And then the shipping component, which at the time was even more complex than it is now because it was so fragmented. And so, if I order X amount of widgets from a factory in China, how do I then get those widgets from that Chinese factory in China to me in Huntsville, Alabama, and the 10 places that it has to hit between then and the 4 different modes of transportation that has to happen. So just sort of trial and errored my way through that, got good at it, started offering it to other people, exited that business. Again, different broker, hoping for a better result. Another slightly better, but not great experience. So at that point, I thought I was kind of done. And keep in mind, this whole time I'm learning because I recognized early that if I can understand marketing at a high level, I don't necessarily need to consider myself to be a marketer. But if I know enough to know what each individual bucket of marketing, what great looks like, whether that's media buying, copywriting, web design, everything that goes into great marketing, email, if I at least know enough to know how to bring in really great people and recognize them and also recognize folks that don't know what they're doing, that's going to give me an unfair advantage over folks that do not know how to do those things because it's such a value driver. Marketing is such a value driver. Same with personal development and mindset. I knew that mental toughness, mindset, abundance, the way that you should think about solving problems was another unfair advantage. So I invested hundreds of thousands of dollars in learning just different types of important marketing pieces, just so that I would understand them. Same with personal development. In fact, the marketing piece is how you and I met because we were together in a copywriting mastermind. I never joined that mastermind with the intent to become a copywriter. It was never my intent. My intent was just to understand the rules of the game. What's good look like? How do I identify what good looks like versus not good? That was my entire intent of being in that, which is unusual. I know it's an unusual mindset, but it's the one that I've got. So fast forward, I think I'm done with business. Financially, I could have just sort of lived off investments. And throughout that same time, I had become a pretty sophisticated investor in different areas. And I had a friend who was trying to sell his company at the time. And he kept asking me, he's like, hey, would you sell my company for me? I was like, I'm not a business broker. And at that time, I didn't even understand how one would become a business broker. Never woke up one day saying I want to be an M&A guy or a business broker. And I said no to him like 6 times. And finally, we were at lunch. And he was taking a call from the person that he was working with at the time. Their contract was about to expire. And they were just feeding him a line of bullshit. And I'm trying to get and I was like, kind of whistling. I'm trying to write on like a napkin in front of him to ask these questions. And finally, he puts his hand, he goes, would you please just help me? And I'm like, all right, sure. So he lets the person go, and I end up helping him prepare the business. There were just some things. His financials were a shit show. They were not organized. He didn't have a good, cohesive understanding of his own supply chain, didn't have any SOPs documented in terms of how things were done. It's just, trial and error. So we worked through all that for about maybe 3 months and then sold it for double what he thought he could get. And the darndest thing about it was, John, that I loved it. I was shocked by it, but I loved it. I got great satisfaction personally out of helping another person navigate through what could be a very stressful journey fraught with a lot of snake pits and vipers and sketchy people, and to come out the other side with a good outcome. And so I started doing that just by referral. To this day, I've never advertised, and it just kept growing larger and larger and larger. And the size of deals that I would do kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And what's interesting is what you say. Every now and then, I will have an objection around the fact that I don't have a Goldman Sachs, or Chase, JP Morgan Chase background. The darndest thing is I hire a lot of those people. I'll bring them in to handle some of the more complex financial engineering parts of the transaction. But what I've realized now after a decade in is that that's not the hard part. The hard part is being able to have the empathy and understanding to know what both sides are trying to accomplish and what they really mean and want versus what they say, and how to navigate through the nuances and emotion that always come up from both sides of a deal without getting too high or too low, and just keeping first things first and the end goal in mind. I sort of accidentally realized that all my unique experiences as a problem solver and someone who had to work with a lot of different types of people is a superpower. And it not only is it not a weakness that I didn't come from a traditional M&A background, it's a huge advantage because I can bring those people in. They're not that hard for me to find. A lot of them, sadly, are out of work. And so when I need someone to look at a really complex set of books or, same with legal, there's plenty of great attorneys out there. And so it's just a lot easier for me when I get a 95-page, articles of incorporation that's quirky to just pay an attorney that I know and be like, okay, I need you to give me 6 bullet points here and tell me what I need to know. And the rest of it, probably not that important. And so all that long-winded story to tell you that I went into it thinking somebody who did not come from one of those very traditional mergers and acquisitions backgrounds probably doesn't have any business owning an M&A firm. Because of the way that I do things, I figured out that for the right type of client, I'm exactly who they need and who they want to work with, because not only can I help them get the best possible outcome, what most brokers have never done is run a business, which is ridiculous, but that's the truth. I have. And I know what it feels like to worry if you're going to be able to make payroll. I know what it feels like to look at ad spend that's ballooning out of control and you're not exactly sure why. I know what it looks like when you have a sales page that nobody's buying from, and to have this feeling of like, I have no idea where to even start or why it's not working, or I need to hire people, or my turnover with my employee. I know what all those things feel like. So I have a great heart for those folks. I also know what it feels like to be looking down the barrel of an exit and worry if you're going to get fairly compensated for what you've. So because of that, I feel a great sense of responsibility to try to. Now, working with me is not easy because you know me well enough to know I'm also very direct. And sometimes you have to say, look, here's the three reasons that your business isn't going to sell at all or for what you want. We can either continue doing things the way that we're doing them and you can have that outcome, or we can make some changes, painful as they may be, and you can get the outcome that you want. Which would you prefer? And the folks that like working with me that become great clients are folks that are willing to embrace that and be uncomfortable and say, okay, I'm just going to trust you and we're going to get it done. But it's been a wild journey. You didn't ask this, but I'll tell you, this is a breaking news. For probably 4 years, I've had folks, just as someone who's worked with both obviously sellers, but I've built these relationships with a lot of institutional buyers too. And the institutional buyers will come and they'll say, hey, we love working with you because you never scream at us. You never get too upset. Just kind of, what do we need to do to make this problem go away? If you ever start a fund, we would love to invest with you. And I've always been like, I don't want to have a fund. Well, the last 6 months or so, I've noticed there's such a discount right now in several sectors that the valuations for companies are they're attractive. Not for the people trying to exit, unfortunately, but there's been some downward pressure that's been created by the tail end of COVID and a lot of other economical and political factors where certain industries are devalued unfairly. And so there's great opportunity. And I've been telling anybody who will listen, no benefit in it for me, but anybody who will listen, guys, you really ought to start looking at this sector. And this is exactly the play that you should run in this sector. And here are the companies that you should avoid. And enough folks said to me recently that I really respect, like, you got a great eye for this. Like, you really should start your own fund, that I finally started to take it seriously. So started chatting with some SEC attorneys that I know. And so, I'll never stop doing it at M&A. I love it. I really enjoy it. But I am going to build a fund on the back end of it because there's so many businesses out there that don't have a home right now, and folks that are wanting to exit, and they're more than happy to take whatever they can get for it. And these are businesses that, with a little bit of remediation and as we were talking about, some of the incredible marketing and sales wisdom of the network that we both have plugged into it, they're going to do really well. The performance will be outstanding. And then once you do that, you flip those to a much larger fish, because the thing that these large institutional investors don't want to do, they don't really want to do the work to get something that maybe is sub $25 million in revenue. They have no interest in doing the work that it takes to get it to $25 million or above, but they're more than happy to stroke a check if you've already done that. So that's sort of the next iteration of some things that JB is going to be playing around with is a fund where we go and we acquire some of these. I don't like to use the word distressed because it has a connotation to it, but functionally they are distressed in terms of their value, but they're only distressed because of the market conditions. If that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. So this kind of was tying into the next questions I was going to ask you, which was the first one was the outcomes when somebody sells a business with your help or buys a business with your help. I mean, you said you don't do any marketing, and I'm guessing you get some referrals, of course. But what do they do after that? Do they sell? Do the buyers want to sell? Do the sellers want to buy? Like, hey, I'm bored off my ass here. I can only play golf so many days a week. I need to buy another business. Or I just bought this business, JB, and it's actually, you know what? It's one business too many. How do I sell it again? Does that stuff happen?
Yeah, great question. Just had this conversation earlier this week, because one thing that I include in my process that does make us a bit unique is that there's a lot of psychological counseling is the best way I can describe it. There's a lot of work that I'll do in the front end prior to an exit to prepare someone for the fact that you've spent whatever amount of time it's been building this business and fighting those battles and slaying those dragons that look different every day, but that's what you've been doing for X amount of time. And that can become your identity. And for most of us who are entrepreneurs, it does. even though we know better. It does. It becomes our identity. Well, then you have that exit, and that's the prize in the sky that you're looking towards for so long. And then when you finally grab it, it's kind of like the gentleman I was telling you about that, built this great business and was still profoundly unhappy. What often happens when someone makes an exit, it doesn't matter the size. You'd think it was the reverse, but especially if someone makes an exit that really should set them up for the rest of their life. Usually for a week or two, they're just on cloud nine. The danger is, one, they'll have an inclination to change their lifestyle. That's usually the first mistake. And they'll start going out and doing things that they never would have done before, expenditures that they never would have made, behaviors that they would not have exhibited before. And then the next thing that happens is depression. It's entrepreneurial depression is what it is. And the reason is the thing that defined your identity for however long it did is no longer true about you. And so if there's no other baseline, if you don't have a really strong either family unit that defines your identity, or a faith, or some way that you yourself are defined as a person, and the business that you just exited was the thing that defined that, of course you're going to have this sort of existential crisis of, well, hell, who even am I? And so I really spend a lot of time trying to prepare folks for the fact that that may and very likely will happen, that it's okay, and that the best thing to do in that situation is to give yourself 6 months without changing anything drastically, and just breathe. Just breathe. Don't make any big purchases. Don't make any large expenditures. Don't drastically change. Don't move to Fiji. I've had that happen.
I did that.
Yeah, what's
I didn't sell a business at the time, but I did move to
You ended
Fiji.
up with a
Better
wife
wife there.
It worked out great for you. So yeah, the emotional part of it. And then to your point on the other side, of the buy side, when I'm working with folks, a lot of it has to do with what the reason was. So if they're looking for a strategic acquisition and it's sort of a bolt-on, that's usually less likely to create significant issues as long as there was a good, solid integration plan, right? So you're this company and you're doing this. You're going to bring on this company because either they're going to open up an avenue, different clients that maybe you can cross-sell to that you haven't had before, or sometimes, maybe it's a financial team that you essentially have brought in to be your in-house financial team because you were paying so much to outsource it that it now makes sense to bring that in. And any profit center that you get from bringing in, the financial firm that you acquire is really sort of bonus, because the real reason that you were bringing them in was to mitigate how much you were already spending. So usually when it's a strategic, as long as there's a good plan to integrate that's well thought out and meticulous, it's fine. Where you run into issues is a true merger where there's an exchange of stock between two principals. And the reason for that is it's like dating. Nobody shows you the less desirable traits in their personality when you're dating, ever. It's only after the marriage actually happens that this super sweet, and to be clear, what I'm about to describe is absolutely not describing my wife. It is not describing my wife. Okay, now that that's out of the way. The person only ever ordered salads, was always impeccably polite, all of this. And then you're married and she lets a giant fart rip in front of you and starts, being critical. And I am sincere. I was joking, but I am sincere. That's not my wife, but it happens. Same thing happens with businesses. What can seem like a really great idea, if you don't share the same core values and the same vision of the future, and you didn't take the time to have the argument before the merger, they're going to happen after. And so if you don't have the same vision and the same core values, and also if your communication styles are not complementary, that's when a lot of problems can happen. And sadly, those usually end up in very expensive divorces. So when I work with folks on buy side, I do some really quirky things. I try to force arguments on purpose. And it seems weird, but the reason I do that is to the benefit of both sides, to understand, hey, you guys just had your first argument. How do we feel about that? Do we feel like everybody handled it well, ethically, responsibly, and we can move forward in a productive way? That's a great sign. Or did we uncover some things about the other person or ourselves that make us a little bit concerned, that suddenly I'm going to go from being the person that makes 100% of the decisions to being a person that makes it by committee? And I don't know that I like that. So incredibly insightful question that most people don't take time to ask. But on the exit side, it usually has more to do with sort of identity. And to answer a question that you asked a minute ago, the number one thing that I see folks do, other than making extravagant purchases after they've made an exit, is they freak out, they have that identity crisis, and then they go buy something else. Usually it works out okay if they buy something else that's generally related to the thing that they just exited, but non-competes can make that a challenge. So instead what they'll do is they'll try to get into an entirely different industry that they've never worked in and know nothing about and catastrophically fail because, and they really didn't need to do it. They'd already won. They had left the casino with a giant windfall, and they're really good at playing blackjack. They won the money. They leave the casino. They freak out. They realize, oh gosh, I'm not sure who I am. I was a gambler before. Now what am I doing? And then they decide to go to the horse track and they bet the entire amount of money that they had on a horse and they don't know a gosh darn thing about horse racing. So those are usually the things that I see. And I spend more than half of the time that I work with. So my work with clients is different in that it's very personal. Not a lot of emails. It's a lot of WhatsApp. It's a lot of voice notes. It's a lot of live conversations at different times, different hours. And it's very intensive. And most of the time, I would say, is me managing emotions, expectation, and identity, and just trying to help to prepare the person for what they're likely going to encounter. And it's also very fulfilling. It's fulfilling when you have that. And I have clients that I worked with years ago that will still call me to this day just to run something by me and say, hey, and sometimes it's unexpected, like my kids about to graduate from high school and they ran into this challenge and we're not sure what to do. Have you ever encountered that? I'm like, well, my kids are younger, but I can tell you what I would do. Or a lot of it's, hey, I'm thinking about making an investment. Would you mind taking a look at the investment and just putting your eyes on it and telling me if you think it's a good idea and poke holes in it? And usually I'll say I will, with the usual agreement that we've always had, which is that you can't get mad at me if I tell you that the baby's ugly. And, it works out that way.
Yeah, completely the opposite of what I think from the outset people would expect a mergers and acquisitions type of business would be about. It all comes down to these same things, isn't it? It's always people and relationships.
Every time, every single time. And I'll tell you another thing that might surprise people if they hear this. There is not really a material difference in an exit at $2 million and an exit at $200 million. The numbers are different, but the things that happen, there's a few more steps, a few more lawyers, etc. But the things that happen, the emotions that take place, the sequence of events, the things that I am at the point now where I can predict are going to happen, they're kind of the same. They're just a different scale. And so it really doesn't matter the size of the deal. If it's a company that has employees and has some sort of product or service that it sells to people for money, and you either exit or buy one of those businesses, really the core tenets of what one of those deals looks like if it's successful, they don't really change with the number of zeros that are attached to it. There's just more people on the phone.
I think that's a great note to call it a wrap. Thank you so much,
Awesome,
JB.
man. Always such a pleasure, my friend.
Do you have a newsletter? I'll put everything in the show description, or where's the best place for people to hear a bit more about what you're doing and find out about your fund and other things that are coming up?
Yeah, so whitebuffaloadvisors.com is the company. We're in the middle of doing a complete refurb of that website. Me personally, you can find me at meetjb.com, another refurb. So I'll end on this final note. I've never been comfortable or desirous of being a celebrity in any way, shape, or form, or anybody's guru. However, you're going to start seeing a lot more of me because what I've realized is that I cannot complain about bad information that people are getting if I'm unwilling to put myself out there. So there'll be a newsletter that's coming soon. I'm not super comfortable with that, but I'm going to do it. Small events, email list, all of that's coming. But the best way to find that is either one of those sites, or you can always just find me on Facebook. It's either Your Buddy JB or Real JB Brown. Same with Twitter, same with Instagram. And I'd love to hear from anybody. And, I'm always willing to have somebody shoot me a question. If you want to call, I'm going to charge you. But if you just want a quick question, you can always shoot me a DM and I'll do my best to answer it.
Fantastic. I will stick all of that in the show notes. Thank you once again for this conversation. It's been super insightful. I think people will get a lot out of it. I'm going to stop the recording now.